Let's see here. Alright, let's go. Alright. Damn it. Oh. Oh. What was it? Chapter 10? Yeah, I think that's right. Back up north. Oh, yeah. Jakarta is coming. Is that being said around in Chile and wherever else leading up to the coup of Allende. Yeah. Back up north. Yeah. Back in Kansas, he thought. That's why the name of the city I grew up in, Jakarta, where I studied, where I learned about socialism and marched against colonialism and racism, has become a synonym for mass murder. Yeah. All right. Now it's chapter 10. Back up north. Give me a second. Really? Come on now. All right. Oh. Chapter 10. Damn. Chapter 10. Back up north. New theaters. In 1975, the Cold War underwent some geographic shifts. Washington abandoned some of the regions where it had been Washington abandoned some of the regions where it had made constant war on communism, while the anti-communist regimes it had helped create continued. Wait. In 1975, the Cold War underwent some geographic shifts. Washington abandoned some of the regions where it had made constant war on communism, while the anti-communist regimes it had helped create continued to scorch the earth all around them. The United States swept South Vietnam. In the Western world, this meant that Saigon, quote, fell. From the perspective of Hanoi, the Vietnamese had only achieved what they should have gotten through the referendum that Washington had helped cancel back in 1956. 3 million had died. The entire nation was militarized, and huge swaths of the country's lush jungles were rendered poisonous for generations because of U.S. chemical warfare. After the fall of Saigon, there was no communist-led mass murder of civilians in Vietnam. Yeah, that's right, because the communists had popular support, had mass support. So why would they murder the masses when they are the masses? Yeah. Always talks about them being the uh, All right. Yeah. Well, what was I saying? Yeah, they're not gonna kill the masses because they are the masses. Unlike what you always say, where it's some leader at the top uh, controlling the masses in the name of the masses and end up hurting them or whatever. No, no, no. It's expanded democracy. Democracy of the people instead of democracy of like landowners, landlords, the rich. Hmm. The massacres came in Cambodia. In 1970, the United States had orchestrated a coup to oust Prince Sihanouk and installed Lon Nol, a general who was supposed to be Cambodia's Suharto. His forces trained in Badong, not far from the site of Sukarno's 1955 Afro-Asian Conference. During Lon Nol's rule, the United States continued to bomb the country indiscriminately, killing hundreds of thousands of people, mostly peasants, in a futile attempt to stop Vietnamese communists from moving through the countryside. Oh. The United States dropped 3 times the tonnage on Cambodia that fell on Japan during World War II, atom bombs included. For the people who survived, the effect of the B 52s on those nearby was reminiscent of the Sofatos in Guatemala. Quote, the terror was complete. One lost control of bodily functions as the mind screamed incomprehensible orders to get out. One Vietnamese official remembered later. Oh shit, man. Damn it. Oh. It's fucking depressing. The disregard for life was staggering and well understood in Southeast Asia. Traumatized refugees flooded Cambodia's cities. After the U.S. backed coup that deposed him, the ousted Prince Sihanouk published a book of memoirs titled My War with the CIA. Quote, we refused to become U.S. puppets or join in the anti-communist crusade, he wrote. Quote, that was our crime. He threw his support behind the small, shadowy, and strange group of Marxists he had repressed while in power. The Khmer Rouge, as he called them in the old colonial language, were the only ones fighting against Lon Nol and the U.S. Army, which was wiping out entire swaths of the population. In 1975, the, quote, Red Khmer took Phnom Penh back from Lon Nol without Vietnamese assistance. They closed the borders and set up one of the most horrifying regimes of the 20th century. It would be years before anyone, even their supposed allies in Hanoi, knew what they were doing. In 1975, Magdalena and Sukarno were still in prison. They were still surviving on starvation rations and forced to endure backbreaking work in Indonesia's system of concentration camps. Ah, shit. For 10 years, it had been drilled into them that they were evil, outcast, unwanted, entirely cut off from family. The tiny bit of rice that prisoners received might have the tiny bit of rice that prisoners received might have sand or glass in it. They would plant or forage for vegetables to supplement their diets. When working the fields, when, when working the fields, prisoners were often forbidden from using sickles because it was one half of the now banned communist logo. What the fuck? Oh, come on, man. That's just silly. All right, hold on. I gotta stop for a second. There we go. Forgot I had muted that too. All right. Actually, wait a minute. I want to actually kind of copy something out real fast. Where was I at? Oh, yeah. Alright. On Bali, one group of prisoners would carefully collect and utilize their own feces to fertilize tiny bits of soil and grow vegetables. They would pass the time by singing songs, either those from the days of Sukarno or based on their own experiences. The refrain to one of them, sung in Spanish, came from the title of Fidel Castro's 1953 speech, quote, La Historia me absolverá. History will absolve me. Oh yeah, nice. It was also in 1975 that the withdrawal of another colonial power sent ripples throughout the Third World. The dictatorship of Portugal, which had ruled since 1933, had fallen apart. The United States developed a, quote, contingency plan to invade parts of Portuguese territory if a government it considered communist took over. Lucky for the Portuguese, Washington allowed the elected left-wing, not communist, government to exist. The new Portuguese administration decided on a rapid withdrawal from what was left of its empire. Wait. Yeah, that's right. But of course, they don't really care if they take power, any kind of a left government takes power in a European country because, well, that matters. They don't care about that so much as the third world. It happened in the third world, partly because they're white, but also because, well, the third world is relied on for cheap labor. The developed world, Portugal, Netherlands, all of them, they the people there, they've had they can't be exploited in the same way. Their labor can't be exploited in the same way because I I would say it's because there has been those liberal advancements to where the the population would not accept that a backslide of that quality of life of enhancements. But the third world has never seen those quality of life enhancements. If that makes sense, I'm not sure it does. So, so the first world has gotten those enhancements, and that's pacified them. And and yeah, so easier to put down the revolts in the third world than it is in the first world. So they didn't care. Probably also from the racism, but still. Although we're seeing constant rollbacks of even how do you constant rollbacks of not only the reforms that socialists brought to the first world, but even the more nationalist reforms that weren't really socialist at all, but like they created a nationalist character. Like when first made, I would say public school system, it wasn't really a socialist character, but is to set up a nationalist character to provide the labor masses with a certain how do I say criteria of how to make sure they see the history of the country and the people to make sure the labor masses fall in line. To make sure the laboring masses will be good workers, be good soldiers, fight for the nation, even though wars now aren't for the nation, they're just for the resources for the owning class. Although technically you would say they always were, even under like say feudalism or the before feudalism, the Roman slave system. Yeah. Anyway. Jakarta looked east. Wait, is that right? Yeah, Portuguese administration decided on a rapid withdrawal from what was left of its empire. Suharto looked east, and he pulled out his old bag of tricks. Among Portugal's newly free colonies was a small nation of East Timor, which shared an island with Indonesian territory. When East Timor gained its independence, Suharto claimed he was threatened by communism on his borders. Calling this a wild exaggeration would be generous. Neither China, the Soviet Union, nor Vietnam was backing the tiny country. The party that oversaw the Timorese Declaration of Independence, Fratelin, did have a left wing, and some of its members used Marxist language, which was hardly surprising for a Portuguese-speaking national liberation movement at the time. But this was enough for Washington, which was convinced that East Timor could become a, quote, Cuba in Asia, even though Nixon had already reestablished relations with the Communist Party in Beijing. He gave Suharto a, quote, big wink, and the Indonesian generals quickly drew up Operasi Suruha, Operation Lotus. Oh, shit, man. Indonesia invaded in December 1975. The people of East Timor did not want the Indonesian military there. Fratelin radicalized and launched a, quote, people's war against the invaders to put down the freedom fighters. The Indonesian armed forces killed up to 300,000 people. Oh, shit. From 1975 to 1979, while both Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter sat in the White House, Washington's closest ally in Southeast Asia annihilated up to a third of the population of East Timor, a higher percentage than those who died under Pol Pot in Cambodia. Oh, man. In former Portuguese colonies in Africa, a different type of bloodshed emerged. In both Mozambique, and Angola, full-on Cold War conflicts broke out, and the participation of the world's greater and lesser powers on both sides. Wait, in both Mozambique and Angola, full-on Cold War conflicts broke out, with the participation of the world's greater and lesser powers on both sides. Still under Brezhnev, the Soviet Union had begun to intervene more forcefully in the Third World, believing temporarily and incorrectly that the United States would grant the Soviets freedom to intervene, just as they had allowed Washington to meddle with Chile in 1973. The United States did not. Washington backed proxies in both countries who fought alongside Zaire, as Mobutu's Congo was called at the time. Apartheid South Africa and Rhodesia all joined together against Moscow's favored movements. Cuba sent 25,000 troops to Angola to assist Moscow's ally. A small number of American and British volunteers, often single, unemployed men, responding to magazine classified ads, enlisted to join white supremacist groups in Rhodesia and South Africa. Oh shit, man. You're killing me, man. Yeah, that sounds about right. God, I just, my fellow white people are just straight up garbage. I swear. I hate that shit. It's just driving me insane. Anyway, I want to copy another thing real fast. I am sorry. Fucking A. Damn it. I didn't remember to do that by accident. Alright. Alright. Let's see here. Alright, where was that at? Alright. White supremacist forces in Rhodesia and South Africa. Alright. Back in formerly Portuguese South America, there was an internal split within Brazil's leadership. Medici was no longer in power, and a new top general, Ernesto Geisel, favored a relaxation of counterinsurgency measures and a so-called abertura, or slow, quote, opening of Brazilian society. The problem was that torture and murder, as they often do, had created powerful elements within the state whose privileges derived from the existence of endless war. They opposed the abertura and favored expanding the violence to include unsuspecting, law-abiding members of the Communist Party. Ah, shit. It's believed that Brazil's own, quote, Operação Jakarta, or Jakarta Operation, was a plan that aimed to intensify rather than moderate repression, and therefore, wait, rather than moderate repression. It is believed that Brazil's own, quote, Operação Jakarta, or Jakarta Operation, was a plan that aimed to intensify rather than moderate repression and therefore derail Abertura. It is also believed that a beloved journalist named Vladimir Herzog was one of its few victims. Herzog was a popular middle-class newsman who operated very openly. Though no big fan of the USSR, he had been inspired by Alexander Dubček's, quote, socialism with a human face in Czechoslovakia. He joined the Brazilian Communist Party in the early 1970s. The PCB was pursuing a moderate path, building a united, quote, democratic front, and was one of the most organized groups opposing the dictatorship among the parts of the Catholic Church. In October 1975, Herzog became editor-in-chief of the public station TV Cultura. A right-wing journalist called this station, quote, TV Viet Cultura, because of his communist, quote, infiltration. What the fuck, man? On October 25, 1975, Herzog was called for questioning by the Brazilian army. He went into the military offices voluntarily. He did not come out. No one brought the official version of the story. That he had killed himself. A grisly photo of his body, swung too close to the ground for hanging to be effective, made the dictatorship's claims even more patently offensive, and his death galvanized the nation into protest. Influential members of the Catholic Church hierarchy took up the cause of Herzog's death, and trained increasingly harsh critiques on the military regime. Instead of escalating Brazil's internal war, the, quote, Jakarta operation had backfired and forced the military to back off. Despite the wishes of some hardline elements, Geisel's Abertura continued. Brazil started to slide, little by little, away from its more hardline anti-communist neighbors. Meanwhile, Chile's Operation Condor continued to expand its activities all around South America, until the continent was a veritable anti-communist killing zone. Thereafter, any real threat to U.S.-aligned authoritarian capitalist development existed mostly in the paranoid minds of the Condor Alliance dictators and their U.S. allies. The fanatical anti-communists won the continent. In 1976, a coup of Argentina brought to power the bloodiest of these regimes. Under General Jorge Rafael Videla, the dictatorship kidnapped, tortured, and disappeared tens of thousands of people. Videla's regime cast a much wider net than Pinochet's men did. This period is often called, somewhat incorrectly, the, quote, dirty war. But there was no war. It was a top-down anti-communist extermination campaign with ideological roots in Argentina's homegrown fascist movement. Quote, subversives were tortured and killed for their real or perceived communism, for their real or perceived atheism, for their real or perceived Jewishness, or just for union activities. Ford Motor Company and Citibank collaborated with the disappearance of union workers. Even beards were suspect. That's why a Brazilian piano player named Tenor Reno was brought in, thrown on a parrilla or grill for torture in Buenos Aires and then drowned. I mean, yeah, that's not surprising since where did a lot of the where did a lot of the Nazis go after World War II? I mean, besides a lot being given asylum in the U.S. due to Operation Paperclip, a lot of them moved to Argentina. That's why there's a lot of German surnames there. A lot of blonde hair, blue eyed Germans. A lot of fucking Nazis. And actually, is this coup? Is that when so like is that when who was it? Perón? When was Perón in power? Juan Perón. Says he died in 1974. Oh yeah, served from 1946 to 1955. Then he was overthrown, and then again served in 1973 until his death in 1974. So like, and that coup they're mentioning it is 1976. So he died before that coup. Okay. Where can I look at? Ah, shit. No. Okay, who is that? Oh yeah, I need to actually change that up. Since I'm doing this, oh, he only died in 2013? 76 to 81. Isabel Perón? I guess. Oh, is that would that be? Oh, the third wife of Jan Perón. Oh, very cool. Oh, okay. So yeah, and I'm guessing she was similar to Jan Perón, then also in politics, which is basically socked down. Well, maybe a more fascist version of socked down. I don't know. Because from the way I hear it, it's almost like there were some labor concessions, but also not great. Like, Still a lot of fascist stuff being done, but some labor concessions just thrown in there to keep people with some labor concessions thrown in there to keep the revolutionary energy down. Representatives from Argentina's military had already been at the meeting that launched Operation Condor in 1975. In the murderous, quote, AAA alliance, the Alianza Anticomunista Argentina had begun unleashing terror under Isabel Martinez de Perón, who served as president from 1974 to 1976. But the true believers were now in power. Admiral Emilio Massera declared Argentina was fighting a, quote, third world war between, quote, dialectic materialism and idealistic humanism. This meant removing the influence of Marx, as well as Freud and Albert Einstein. General Antonio Domingo explained how this worked. First, quote, first we kill all subversives, then we kill all of their collaborators, then those who sympathize with subversives, and then we kill those that remain indifferent, and finally we kill the timid. Oh shit, man. You're fucking killing me, man. Alright, I gotta copy something else out real fast. My God. Just oh, fuck. Alright. Okay. And finally, we kill the timid. Yeah, fuckers. But the Condor Alliance didn't limit their activities to their own continent. They built upon the, quote, stay behind armies Frank Wisner had helped to build in Europe to pursue their enemies in Germany, Spain, Italy, and Ireland. Excuse me. The men behind Operation Condor often considered the nonviolent democracy and human rights activists operating abroad to be, the men behind Operation Condor often considered the nonviolent democracy and human rights activists operating abroad to be even more dangerous than armed guerrillas at home. Nonviolent activists more dangerous than armed guerrillas? Wait, what? Fucking monsters. Most infamously, this logic led U.S. citizen known CIA contact and Condor operative Michael Townley to murder former Chilean Foreign Minister Orlando Lettier in the heart of Washington, D.C. Wait. Most infamously, this logic led U.S. citizen, known CIA contact, and Condor operative Michael Townley to murder former Chilean foreign minister. Or, wait. Damn it. Most infamously, this logic led U.S. citizen, known CIA contact, and Condor operative Michael Townley to murder former Chilean foreign minister Orlando Lettier in the heart of Washington, D.C. A car bomb placed on Embassy Row blew Lettier's legs off, killing him instantly. His 25-year-old American assistant, Ronnie Moffat, staggered from the car and slowly drowned in her own blood. Townley is now in FBI witness protection. Okay, wait a minute. Is Michael Townley? Isn't that the name of the character in GTA 5? Like, isn't that his was that like his regular name? Or like his original name or his witness protection name? I think that's right. Also, man, yeah, I don't know. Okay. I keep on wanting to clip stuff out. In 1978, Ng Diok Ten was admitted to the University of Sao Paulo, USP. This was a huge... excuse me. Alright, you know what? I'll just get some water, see if that helps clear my throat. Damn it. This was a huge accomplishment for an immigrant from a poor Asian country. She would be studying, free, at the best college in Brazil, only 15 years after she and her family shoved off from Jakarta on that rusty old hospital ship. But for her hardworking family, this seemed natural. Wait. Yeah. She worked like hell at her good, almost entirely white high school, and her parents put their heads down too, avoiding political conflict like the plague that it had been for their whole lives. It also felt natural as she drifted toward the left-wing counterculture at USP. Brazilian universities at the time, especially the elite institutions, were hotbeds of student activism. This wasn't the stead, ultra-disciplined communist organization of the 1950s and 60s. This was a much more eclectic group of kids This was the era of Tropicalia, a global rock and roll devoured and reconstituted as a mix of Brazilian high art concept and savage indigenous pride. Cultural liberation, and more than anything else, opposition to the censorship imposed by the dictatorship. Ingyak also realized very quickly that there were no black students in her class at USB either. Hmm. Wait, savage indigenous pride? What? What? That's kind of gross. Alright. It was in this milieu that Ink, as everyone called her now, met her Uruguayan friend Hernan Pietro Schmidt, or, quote, Tupa, as they called him. He was always terrified of the police, for reasons she didn't quite understand. He wasn't even a particularly active or left wing student, but when he told her, it all made sense, as did his nickname. His father had been a Tupamaro, a member of the Uruguayan left wing group that had prompted Brazil to threaten invading the neighboring country in 1971. Under the dictatorship that consolidated power in Uruguay starting in 1973, the new anti-communist regime sent men into Hernan's home and took his father away. She didn't know it, but this was the fourth time that Washington's violent anti-communist campaign had affected her life personally. First, the U.S.-backed military, the nascent, quote, state within a state, had ignited anti-Chinese riots in her part of Indonesia, forcing her family to flee the country. Second, her family lived through Brazil's U.S.-backed military coup in 1964. Third, the mass murder in Indonesia demolished life for the relatives who had stayed home. And now, one of her college buddies was the victim of an Operation Condor campaign. That same year, 1978, alarm bells began to ring far north of Sao Paulo. A new wave of guerrilla movements seemed to threaten the fragile military oligarchies that had been established by Frank Wisner and the CIA back in the 1950s. So, with the help of Washington, some of South America's most messianic anti-communists turned their attention north. Essentially, Operation Condor was extended to Central America. Oh yeah, gonna be about Nicaragua and the Sandinistas. That happened in the 80s. Maybe 78, 79, and 80s ish. Somewhere around in there. Alright. 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 During the sea, the countries of Central America are far more united than the nations of South America. Its peoples know one another well, and they tend to experience the waves of history in a similar fashion. This is especially true of the four most populous countries in the middle: Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Honduras. Belize, at the very top, is a British colony, and down at the bottom, Panama took a very different historical path after the U.S. created the nation in order to build a canal. and world history had crashed over the riddle subcontinent with punishing violence over the past few centuries. In the late 1970s and 80s, this process rose to astonishing levels of brutality. And I believe there was even they were all those countries were even united for a short time under like a United States of Central America or something like that. Greater Republic of Central America. Uh, Later, the United States of Central America, uh, which we plan to know to be known as the Republic of Central America, short-lived political union between El Salvador, Honduras, and Nicaragua, lasting from 1896 to 1898, so like 2 years before it all collapsed. So yeah, signing of Amapala Treaty, Treaty of Amapala. Oh. Guatemala and Costa Rica both considered joining, but neither of them eventually did so. Okay, yeah. And wait, damn it. What was that? Costa Rica and Guatemala? So Guatemala technically not in it, like the nations mentioned, but they also didn't mention Costa Rica. Yeah. Because Costa Rica's like right in here, and then Guatemala's like right in here ish. I know it starts formed, I think. Yeah, it started formed in the start of Vicky 2. Vicky. But that game starts in like 1936. And it collapses pretty fast. They actually have. The game actually gave the nation cores on Belize there, which is still occupied by the UK, and of course the other two nations, Guatemala and Costa Rica. Quick collapse. Neither side, but they showed interest. Constitution ratified, changing the name. Oh, 12 days after the Constitution was ratified, Salvadoran president was overthrown. A fellow member of the revolution, which ousted Aseta 4 years earlier. So he pulled that nation out, and I guess with them pulling out, the rest just pulled out too. Oh, they tried again in 21 and 22 for a union, but fell apart. Interesting. Anyway, that was just a interesting aside. Oh. Before this new storm of blood and screams even started, brutal oppression was already the rule of the vast majority of the population. Wait. Well, yeah. The region was ruled by dictators who rarely bothered to hide their cruelty. The practice of, quote, forced labor, that is, the enslavement of the indigenous peoples who had started centuries prior, was still widespread. Excuse me. In Guatemala, the terror that started in 1954 and accelerated in 1965 after the arrival of John Gordon Mine and John P. Wangan had never stopped. The year those two men arrived, 1965, El Salvador, Costa Rica, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Panama came together to formalize military links and intelligence sharing within El Consejo de Defensa Centroamericana, CONDECA, a kind of proto-alliance to put down the guerrilla threat. That threat was real. Mine himself was killed in 1968 by the FAR, the first rebel group formed in Guatemala in the wake of the 1960 clash over the CIA's use of a Guatemalan base to train Cuban exiles for the Bay of Pigs invasion. The violence unleashed by the Guatemalan dictatorship during the civil war that followed was indiscriminate. Right-wing terror groups like La Mano Blanca, quote, the White Hand, the new anti-communist organization, and the Anti-Communist Council of Guatemala started their own massacres. With the support of U.S. Green Berets and these death squads, right-wing terror groups like La Mano Blanca, quote, the White Hand, the new anti-communist organization, and the Anti-Communist Council of Guatemala started their own massacres. With the support of U.S. Green Berets, and these death squads were eventually incorporated into the state. The disappearances that started in 1966 had expanded by the 1970s to transform Guatemala's cities into hunting grounds for any kind of perceived leftist or subversive. The number of people desaparecido by the state rose into the tens of thousands. If you were a union member, a student activist, a left-wing politician, a critical journalist, or even a homeless child, you knew that the regime might come for you. As tension periodically rose around you, friends disappeared forever. You escalated evasive tactics, then settled back into your, quote, normal life of low-level terror. If you survived this time, life was a permanent cat-and-mouse game, and Guatemala City became a deadly, sprawling obstacle course, sometimes for the entire lifespan of its victims. Miguel Angel Albazuras, the same little schoolboy who had never forgot the trauma of his sulfatos bombs dropped near his school during the U.S.-backed coup in 1954, grew into a union organizer. The unions were not uniformly left-wing. As a team, not long after the overthrow of Arbenz, he joined the Catholic Christian Workers Movement, and by the 1970s, he was a bit of a small-time leader. The union movement had moderate communists and Christian Democrats, as well as some who supported the more radical guerrillas. The government did not care much for these distinctions. In 1977, they busted open the door of a union meeting Miguel was attending, firing their guns. Miguel fled onto the roof and jumped from building to building to escape. Another time, they shot down several of his colleagues in front of the Coca-Cola factory. He knew he was lucky, in a way, because they apparently didn't want to simply kill him. They easily could have done that in the street, with some men in a car with machine guns. They wanted to capture, torture, and disappear him, hopefully getting some information along the way and creating a mystery around his death. Since that was a little harder to pull off, he kept bobbing and weaving until he found a way out of the country. Quote, "We could never sleep in the same place for too long. We didn't see our families. It was constant suspicion, unending fear. We didn't know what was going on, but we knew that bodies were appearing everywhere around us. So we knew enough." By 1978, things were changing for Central America. In Nicaragua, a left-wing guerrilla group inspired by the Cuban Revolution, the Sandinistas, was poised to win power. In El Salvador, the government responded to protests against an obviously rigged election with a massacre. Hundreds were killed. Then a coup there led to a civil military regime, which also devolved into murderous repression, leading the civilians to quit, and support grew for leftist guerrillas. All this made Guatemala's government nervous about its own survival. At home, new guerrilla groups were taking over for the older MR-13 and FAR, which had been crushed by the U.S.-backed insurgency campaign. The most prominent new group was the Ejército Guerrero de los Pobres, EGP, or the Guerrilla Army of the Poor. Unlike the FAR, which followed Che Guevara's, quote, focus strategy of organizing small guerrilla units, the EGP sought to enlist the larger rural population in the guerrilla struggle, emulating the victorious Viet Cong. Yeah, that sounds like enlisting the masses for People's War. That sounds kind of Maoist, actually. So, oh yeah, fucking sounds great. The Guatemalan government began to kill indigenous people en masse, simply because of their ethnic background. Entire ethnicities, whole tribes, complete villages, were marked as either communist or liable to become communist. They were often people who had only a vague idea of what Marxism or the guerrilla groups were. This was new, different from the urban terror tactics, in which government forces kidnapped individual people. For the Mayans and other indigenous groups, the army would come and simply kill every single one of them. The close collaboration of the U.S. officials with Central American dictatorships as they slaughtered their own populations is well documented, far better than U.S. activities in Indonesia leading up to October 1965. The scale of the violence, however, and the consequences of the actions are often underestimated. Miguel Angel Albazuras and others who lived through the late 1970s and 1980s, in Central America always stressed that these new Central American guerrilla movements emerged after attempts at peaceful transition to democracy were brutally suppressed or indeed exterminated. They say that almost every political ideology in the world, not just the socialism and Marxism dominant in those guerrilla groups allows for armed resistance against tyrants, and that includes the U.S. revolutionary tradition. I mean, yeah, that's pretty much correct. I mean, what's that even in the Constitution, the Second Amendment? Right to bear arms for the creation of a well regulated militia. Because the U.S. government is all about having its own little force of irregulars besides an actual army uh, for uh, for defense. The army is the regular troops for sending to uh, for sending out to do battle. But you need a militia if the army ever gets overrun. The militia is to supplement the army. Nor is it surprising that the surviving movements were left-wing militants. By the late 70s, most of the moderate dissidents were dead. Yeah, I mean, they killed the ones that wanted peace. So, the ones that wanted electoralism. So, who's the ones that are still around? The ones that armed themselves and protected themselves. They knew that the right was going to come to kill them. In January 1979, the Khmer Rouge fell, and the world found out what had been happening in Cambodia. The government, if it can be called that, fell because the Vietnamese communists realized what Pol Pot had been doing, and also because he bafflingly attacked his more powerful former allies. Vietnam invaded and easily toppled the secretive, psychotic cabal that had been terrorizing the country since 1975. The Khmer Rouge were driven into the forests and mountains along the Thai border. Vietnam took over most of the country, closed down the killing fields, and allowed Cambodians to return to the cities under a government of their own creation. Around a quarter of Cambodians were dead. The United States did not celebrate the fall of the murderous Khmer Rouge. China, which had been moving closer to Washington since Nixon's visit in 1973, was allied with Pol Pot. Deng Xiaoping was furious and unwilling to tolerate what he perceived as Vietnam's aggression against China's ally. He resolved to invade Vietnam and told the U.S. about the plan. President Carter said he could not openly condone an attack, but assured Deng he understood that, quote, China cannot allow Vietnam to pursue aggression with impunity. Fuck off, Carter. And he proudly promised to support Beijing if the Soviets threatened to assist the Vietnamese. Man, fuck off, Carter. Just fuck off. I mean, every now and then we'll be like, Carter wasn't that bad. Nah, man, fuck off. He was still bad. He's... He might have had more polish than the other turds, but he was still a turd. So, yeah. The Chinese invasion of Vietnam in 1979 is often forgotten, for two reasons. First, it complicates narratives about the putative international communist conspiracy, or at least the supposedly monolithic Asian communist movement. According to uninformed Western thinking, China and Vietnam were supposed to be on the same side. But more importantly, the episode has been forgotten because the Vietnamese immediately defeated and humiliated the Chinese People's Liberation Army. After decades of battle with France and the US, the Vietnamese were too good for the nation that had once ruled them for more than 1,000 years. Yeah, that's right. Although, did they actually rule them, or was it like tributary status, or like it was like they would send them money or whatever because they often did uh, uh, China for the longest time just wanted like tributaries of their neighbors to be their tributaries, where it's like you're 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 kind of under them, but you're kind of not. I don't know. Uh, all right. Let me see. What are we doing? Yeah, right there. All right. Clashes with China in the second half of the 1970s also led to the worst human rights violations under the new communist regime in United Vietnam. Partly as a way to undermine the power of ethnic Chinese in Vietnam, seen as potentially disloyal, Hanoi announced the nationalization of all private businesses. Hundreds of thousands of refugees set off, including the so called, quote, boat people, penniless and looking for a new life, and tens of thousands died. Eh, I kind of want to say fuck off for this because nationalization of private businesses is not human rights violations. Just fuck off. All right, I gotta stop to uh, do another pace for a second. I really should actually put on some kind of music whenever I do this. Which I'll need to look at. I'll need to bring up something for that. What was I doing? Uh, Alright, oh yeah. What was I gonna. Shit. Oh, no. Not with that. Not with that. Oh, fuck. Okay, I got that up so that I can play that next time. I don't know if that's gonna happen though. Penniless and looking for a new life, and tens of thousands died. At the time, Benny was in Thailand. He had finished his stint in Chile and returned to Bangkok with the UN. Not long after he arrived, a colleague of his, a young Australian, came back from the Cambodian Thai border with wild tales. There were Cambodians stumbling out of the jungle, starving and collapsing on Thai soil, he said. After the fall of the Khmer Rouge, they were fleeing to whomever might help them. Benny went to see for himself. At the border, he broke down in tears. He saw, quote, refugees in rags, fleeing the country by the tens of thousands, often emaciated and barely able to walk, seemingly unable to speak or smile, and immediately sent a cable to New York. Quote, please send me to Cambodia. He was sent to New York instead, where he had to witness something just as shocking. The United States chose to recognize the remnants of the Khmer Rouge at the United Nations, keeping its tiny regime alive and refusing to recognize the Vietnamese allied government. This would last for years. Partly, it was a way to appease Carter's new ally in Beijing. But Benny knew it was something else too. Quote, they hated Vietnam too much, Benny said. Quote, they couldn't forgive them for winning the war. I mean, yeah, that's 100% true. Much to his chagrin, ASEAN, the Organization of Southeast Asian States that Indonesia had helped found in 1967, backed the Khmer Rouge too. In Central America, however, Jimmy Carter's government tapped the brakes a bit on brutal realpolitik. In this era, after both Watergate and the 1975 Church Committee investigations into the CIA and FBI, the U.S. media were less reflexively uncritical of Washington's. Wait. In this era, after both Watergate and the 1975 Church Committee investigations into the CIA and FBI, the U.S. media were less reflexively uncritical of Washington's covert and overt Cold War schemes abroad. Outlets such as the New York Times and Washington Post played crucial roles in publicizing the massacre at Penzos, Guatemala, the village where the military was caught gunning down men, women, and children in 1978. You know, I don't know about that. I've heard differently from, in say, Inventing Reality by Parenti, where they, where the media, Times and the Post, would still give give more would defer more to the State Department in Central America, especially with the Sandinistas and whatnot. They deferred more to the State Department's stuff on the Sandinistas or like the murder of the Catholic, the Jesuit priests down there that were more left wing and activist. Washington banned the sale of weapons to regimes that did not meet basic human rights criteria. Rather than even try, the Guatemalan dictatorship, now run by a man named Fernando Romeo Lucas Garcia, turned to Israel and Tehran, which stepped in to supply the weapons and assistance instead. Okay, so yeah, more than likely, U.S. just sells it to Israel and Taiwan, who then just sells it back to the dictators in Central America. Fucking Iran Contra over here. U.S. Guatemala collaboration continued at a number of levels, but Carter's position was enough to enrage some of the most committed anti-communists in the hemisphere. Mario Sandoval Alarcon, one of the founders of La Mano Blanca, and now vice president, accused the Carter administration's Inter-American Commission on Human Rights of being, quote, a Marxist instrument that has used the cause of human rights as a tool for slander. Fuck, man. No. Carter is no Marxist. If anything, him and people like him are the friendly face on anti-communist imperialism. It's just you have a friendly face, and you have the scowl. Just like what similar to what Malcolm X would say, where you have the conservative that would scowl at you, that show they hate you, and then the liberal that would smile at you, and then stab you in the back. Or with MLK, the white moderate and the white moderate and the Ku Klux Klaner. All the same things. All the same things.
Traveling through this world of war, yet there's no sickness, toil, or danger in that bright world to which I go. I'm going there to see.
Okay. Alright. That's playlist from Castle Cat Cinema right there, which I played a bit the last stream. Yeah. Anyway. Oh. That one song is 1917 song Wayfaring Stranger. Music cover by a Rachel Hardy. I'm not sure who that is. But anyway. That playlist also has a cover of Which Side Are You On? Yellow Rose of Texas, Rose of Texas instrumentals, uh, Johnny Comes Marching. I'm not sure which one that is. Instrumentals version of that. Uh, and then I'm not sure what these other ones are, because it's some other ones. Rebel Girl, also covered by Rachel Hardy. I'm not sure what Bright Sunny South is, or Long Way to Tipperary, or Battle Cry of Freedom. Although this seems to be all American Civil War Kaiserite stuff, so it may actually be less left wing oriented and more America oriented, or maybe a combination of the two. I don't know. Anyway, back to the book. In July 1979, the Sandinistas took Managua and set up a government in Nicaragua. For leftists across Central America, this was a moment of effervescence, just as 1970 had been for Chilean socialists. The Sandinistas had not only won, they had gotten away with it. Even The Clash, the punk band over in England, sang ecstatically about the shocking development. For the very first time ever, when they had a revolution in Nicaragua, there was no interference from America. Human rights in America. The people fought the leader, and up he flew. With no Washington bullets, what else could he do? Oh yeah, man. Alright, give me a second. I'm gonna go back to this one.
I am a poor wayfaring stranger while traveling through this world of woe. Yet there's no sickness, toil, or danger in that bright world to which I go. I'm going there to see my Father. I'm going there no more.
Alright. In its early days, the Communist Party in Nicaragua had opposed the Sandinistas' emphasis on armed struggle. Over the years, the Frente Sandinista de Liberación Nacional, FSLN, split into three factions. The group that won out, the relatively moderate and third faction known as the Terceristas, favored a broad tactical alliance with the, quote, bourgeoisie. It was this group, led by Daniel and Humberto Ortega, that took power as the dominant part of a coalition government. The Terceristas will stand in democratic elections. Like Ho Chi Minh, Mao, Arbenz, Fidel, Sukarno, and Allende before them, the Terceristas initially hoped to set up a government that Washington could tolerate. Infamously, these hopes would be dashed when Reagan took over and began funding the Contra rebels. But the leaders of Operation Condor did not wait for the go-ahead from Reagan to handle the leftist government taking root in Central America. In 1977, Convinced that Carter had abandoned them in their, quote, holy war on communism, Argentine officials began providing military training to the Somoza regime in Nicaragua. After the 1979 Sandinista victory, they set up a base in Honduras to reach Guatemalans and Nicaraguans. After the 1979 Sandinista victory, they set up a base in Honduras to teach the Guatemalans and Nicaraguans the arts of counter-revolution and repression. Oh, crap. Oh, wait. Central American soldiers went to Chile for training in anti-communist counterinsurgency tactics. The 1980 meeting of the Latin American chapter of the World Anti-Communist League, held in Buenos Aires, enabled death squad leaders to form even closer ties with the South American governments, as well as U.S. Republican congressmen. The methods that were used in Central America in the following years reflected the defining features of Operation Condor: targeted abductions and murders by multinational, quote, hunter-killer squadrons, often made up of Contras and Honduran commandos in civilian clothes. The methods that were used in Central America in the following years reflected the defining features of Operation Condor: targeted abductions and murders by multinational, quote, hunter-killer squadrons, often made up of Contras and Honduran commandos in civilian clothes, clandestine transfers of prisoners across borders, methods like disappearance, torture, and assassination of victims, including the use of electric shock, the, quote, capucha asphyxiation, and the throwing of live people from helicopters. Interrogations of prisoners by officers from several countries, and detention centers for foreign disappeared prisoners. Damn it, man. Fuck. When Reagan took over, Washington returned to more open and aggressive anti-communist tactics than had been seen in 2 decades. The CIA eagerly joined the Argentines in Honduras, and in the biggest agency operation since the Bay of Pigs, began training and funding the Contra rebels. The Contras were not a regular army, and never seriously tried to best the Sandinistas in a direct confrontation. They were a well-funded terrorist group, seeking to destabilize the regime however they could, and their worldview and tactics were radically transformed by the fanatical anti-communism of their sponsors. The former, quote, public relations chief of the Contras, Edgar Chamorro, made clear that the powerful ideological influence of the Argentine officers and CIA operations reshaped their movement. Historian Patrice McSherry writes that, quote, the anti-Sandinistas were originally concerned with retaining their private property and oligarchical power and privilege, or pursuing revenge, but the messianic anti-communist ideology of the Argentines and the Americans began to reshape the rationale of the war. Yeah, that sounds about right. They also learned lessons from abroad. The CIA officer going by John Kirkpatrick, with counterinsurgency experience in the Phoenix program in Vietnam, compiled a training course that included an assassination manual for the Contras. One section was titled, quote, implicit and explicit terror. According to Argentine journalist Juan Pablo Sipka and Ignacio Gonzalez Janssen, the Argentines and the Central Americans had also discussed employing the Jakarta method. They report that in the early 1970s, before the country had fallen to the brutal Videla dictatorship, the leader of Argentina's far-right AAA death squad, a politician named Jose Lopez Rega, was in Franco's Spain. There, he met with Maximo Zepeda, the leader of Guatemala's new anti-communist organization, Death Squad. They spoke of the, quote, Plan Jakarta, and what it entailed, a, quote, prophylactic coup that would allow them to defeat the Marxists by, quote, virtually exterminating them after conservatives took power. These Argentine authors claimed the meeting was arranged by the U.S. ambassador to Spain, Robert Hill, and that frequent CIA collaborator Zepeda not only handed over some, quote, Plan Jakarta reports he held, but told his anti-communist comrade that Washington could assist him in forming, quote, shock troops to put the plan into action in Argentina. Ah, shit, man. Quote, we don't need to kill 1 million like in Indonesia, Lopez Rega reportedly said, quote, because we can get it done with 10,000. He guessed low. Anti-communists killed far more than that in Argentina. Wait. Alright. On March 24, 1980, Catholic Archbishop Oscar Romero began to say Mass in San Salvador, the capital of El Salvador. Romero had recently spoken out against the wanton human rights abuses committed by the government. After he finished his sermon that night, a man burst into the church and murdered him. Yeah, this right here, Romero, his murder was essentially not talked about a lot in the U.S. press, which you would learn if you. That was talked about a lot in Inventing Reality, and also Manufacturing Consent, by both Edward Herman and Edward Herman, who wrote Manufacturing Consent, and Michael Parente, who wrote Inventing Reality. And the U.S. press didn't really talk much about Romero, but they talked a shitload about the Catholic priest that was murdered in Poland. Now, I wonder why. Maybe because this guy was murdered by far-right forces, anti-communist forces, while the Polish priest was murdered by was Soviet-aligned forces. The assassination was carried out by a death squad led by Major Roberto de Albusen, a fanatical anti-communist who had trained at the School of the Americas in 1972, whereas Fort Leavenworth is an all-purpose military academy for students from all over the world. The School of the Americas, based in the U.S.-controlled, quote, Panama Canal Zone, was a training ground for Latin American, quote, counterinsurgents. The school became so notorious for that Panama expelled it from its territory, and the school changed its name in 2000 to the, quote, Western Hemisphere Institute for Security Cooperation. The Abusan also attended the Political Warfare Cadres Academy in Taiwan, which by then had provided training to officials from almost every Latin American nation. In 1983, the Abusan summed up the actually existing anti-communist ideology very well. Quote, "You can be a communist," he told reporter Laurie Beckland. Quote, even if you personally don't believe you are a communist. Fuck, man. When the Salvadoran Civil War got underway, the military backed by Ronald Reagan made scorched earth tactics a routine part of its modus operandi. On December 11, 1981, reports surfaced of a massacre at El Mazat village. Salvadoran troops executed more than 900 men, women, and children with U.S.-made assault rifles. The next day, Reagan appointed a Harvard-trained former liberal, Elliot Adams. The next day, Reagan appointed a Harvard-trained former liberal named Elliot Abrams to serve as Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs. Put simply, his job was to defend U.S. allied right-wing regimes to the press and shield them from criticism coming from appalled human rights groups. Abrams called the accounts of the slaughter in El Mazat, including those published in the New York Times, communist propaganda. This is still the most famous atrocity of the Salvadoran Civil War, but it was only a tiny fraction of the violence unleashed on civilians. For years and years, the savagery dragged on and only deepened because Washington refused to allow the right-wing government to negotiate a political solution with the rebels. Since the rebels had links to, quote, communists in Nicaragua, no negotiation was possible, according to Reagan's logic. Fuck Reagan. But it was in Guatemala, Central America's biggest country, and the site of the CIA's first major, quote, victory in the hemisphere back in 1954, that normal people faced the largest bloodbath unleashed by the Cold War in the Western Hemisphere. The small community of Elom is nestled between misty mountains in northwest Guatemala, closer to the Mexican border than to the capital. The people are Mayan and speak Ixil, not Spanish, and for decades they had been either subsistence farming or working for pennies on a nearby ranch. That ranch was owned by rich white men and sat on the land taken from the Mayans centuries ago. And over the years, it kept getting bigger and bigger. Elom is too far from Guatemala City to have been affected by Jacobo Arben's incipient land reform program in 1954. Residents barely heard about the reforms that were snuffed out by the CIA. In 1981, however, global politics arrived in the village. First, the EGP, the Ejército Guerrero de los Pobres, came to visit. Speaking Spanish, the guerrillas explained that they were on the Mayans' side, that they were building a revolution that would help them get their land back, and they were fighting for them. Josefa Sanchez del Barrio, who was 16 at the time, remembers that most of the villagers were politely receptive to this message, if a bit puzzled about the specifics. Few of them spoke Spanish. It wasn't quite clear that it It wasn't quite clear what these 30 to 40 revolutionaries in green fatigues planned to do, or how the villagers were supposed to help them. But the villagers thanked them, gave them the customary hospitality of thick corn tortillas and some kind of words, and waved goodbye. Not long after, the army sent in men pretending to be guerrillas. It didn't take long for the villagers to figure out what was going on. The men's costumes were shoddy. One even wore a cheap fake beard, and they were acting all wrong, asking too many questions and treating the villagers aggressively. The guerrillas hadn't acted that way at all when they came. This was not a sophisticated undercover operation. They were clearly just some young military men trying to figure out who was most sympathetic to the rebels. Oh shit. Yeah, I gotta stop for a second. This part is actually kind of interesting. So listen to a cover of What Side Are You On?
They say in Harlan County there are no neutrals there. You'll either be a Union man or a thug for J.H. Blair. I'm a miner's daughter and a miner bound to none. We'll be with you, fellow workers, till every battle's won. Tell me, which side are you on, boys? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, boys? Which side are you on? Come of all you good workers, good news to you I'll tell, of how that good old Union has come in here to dwell. Tell me, which side are you on, boys? Which side are you on? Oh, workers, can you stand it? Oh, tell me how you can. Will you be a lousy scab, or will you be a man? Which side are you on, boys? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, boys? Which side are you on? Don't scare for the buses, don't listen to their lies. Us poor folks haven't got a chance unless we organize. Which side are you on, boys? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, boys? Which side are you on?
Where was that at? Motherfucker. No. Nope. Holy shit, dude. Pressing the wrong buttons over here. Okay. Okay, where was I? Oh yeah, yeah. The army came back because they were clearly just some young military men trying to figure out who was most sympathetic to the rebels. In January 1982, the military men came back. This time, they were in their army uniforms, but with black paint on their faces. They burst into Josepha's home. It didn't surprise her that her family was on their list. Her father had been part of a small group that tried, back in the 70s, to ask the local government down in the nearest city to save their land. They dragged away her husband's father. Oh, excuse me. They smashed Josepha in the head with a rock. Then several men shoved a napkin into her mouth and raped her. Oh shit, man. Fuck. I no. I didn't see that coming, and I really should have. And as soon as I said the word, I just want to die. All in all, 30 people were taken that day, never to return. A few days later, the soldiers came back and took Josepha's father and brother. In February, the soldiers came again. Josepha's other brother was working in the field, and they lobbed a grenade at him and killed him. All in all, 30 people were taken that day, never to return. A few days later, the soldiers came back and took Josepha's father and brother. In February, the soldiers came again. Josepha's other brother was working in the field, and they lobbed a grenade at him and killed him. They took more people away that day, and this time they burned down the empty houses as they left. Those motherfuckers, man. Antonio Cavacaba, a young boy, realized something was wrong that day when he came back from working in the fields. As he approached his home, he saw his mother standing in the doorway, wearing the long red skirt worn by Mayan women in the region, staring blankly into the distance. "What's wrong?" he asked her. She told him about the fires. The soldiers had burned an old woman alive in her home as they left. Some people began to discuss running, but there was nowhere to go except into the mountains, where they'd soon run out of food. This was the worst violence their community had ever experienced. They came to the conclusion that finally it must be over. They were wrong. Oh no. On March 23rd, the soldiers came back at 5 in the morning and woke up every single person in Ilum. They were wearing black paint again. Quote, "Come on, there is a town meeting. You are going." They told Antonio and Josepha and everyone else. They walked the villagers to the tiny town square. They sent the men into the little church behind the plaza and the women into the tiny courthouse next door. Antonio heard one of them fidgeting on the radio, talking to a superior. Quote, "We're going to kill the guerrillas," he said. One by one, then two by two, They brought men out of the church, stood them in front of the schoolhouse, and shot them. Everyone could see each murder. That was clearly the point. After about 100 were dead, they stopped. Wait. In front of the schoolhouse. But it said little church and courthouse. So, like, did they take them in front of the. When saying in front of the schoolhouse, was it in front of the courthouse so that the women in there could see the men being taken out and shot in front? I don't know. That's what it makes me think of, even though it's using different words. Quote, "We're only killing the ones that look guilty, the ones that look afraid," one of the soldiers said. Other villages weren't so lucky. In many parts of this region, the military simply killed every man, woman, and child. The government had decided that the exil were intrinsically communist, or at least very likely to become communist. In Indonesia, it may not have been the case that the mass murder was genocide. In Indonesia, it may not have been the case that the mass murder was genocide. It was simply anti-communist mass murder. In Guatemala, it was anti-communist genocide. On March 23, 1982, General Efrain Rios Montt took power in Guatemala in a military coup. He was an evangelical Christian, which made him a special favorite of Ronald Reagan. Oh, fuck both of them. Just fuck both of them. And continued the genocide in a slightly different fashion. Some indigenous people from ethnically suspect communities were herded into state-built ideas modelos, quote, model villages, built to help indigenous people start new lives in suitably non-communist fashion, which often amounted to little more than deadly concentration camps. Fuck, man. Fuck. I want to know if. So he was evangelical Christian, but like, is he more white or what? I'm guessing that he definitely wasn't indigenous. So maybe like combination of white and white and like like white and Hispanic maybe. I'm guessing. I don't know. I'm curious. I'm just curious as to how white this guy would be. I would guess very, but I don't know. I can't confirm that since it doesn't say. For many others, the massacres simply continued apace. As was the case in Indonesia, in Brazil, and Argentina, Mott's religious zeal gave the anti-communist violence a theological justification. Quote, "They are communists, and therefore atheists, and therefore they are demons, and therefore you can kill them." Is how the one Civil War victim, now the head of one of Guatemala's most prominent research organizations, summarizes the logic. The vast majority of the murdered were practitioners of traditional Mayan religions. Oh yeah, yeah. They would definitely see them as demons then. I hate evangelicals. I hate them so much. The remaining residents of Elam were forced into slavery, but this time they had to work for the military. Antonio was forced to join a militia and grew up, quote, fighting the guerrillas for the rest of the 1980s. They rebelled quietly by intentionally missing when shooting at the, quote, enemy. Josefa quickly married. If she had not, she would have been forced to, quote, marry one of the soldiers watching over the Aldea Modelo, forced into sexual slavery like so many of her friends. The village was liquidated and burned to the ground. This was all part of Rios Mott's new strategy of fighting communism. This was all part of Rios Mott's new strategy for fighting communism. Quote, the gorilla is the fish, the people are the sea. He said, quote, if you cannot catch the fish, you have to drain the sea. Damn it! From 1978 to 1983, the Guatemalan military killed more than 200,000 people. Around a third of these were taken away and, quote, disappeared, largely in urban areas. Most of the rest were indigenous Mayans, massacred in the open air of the fields and mountains where their families had lived for generations. The Salvadoran Civil War took 75,000 lives. Again, the majority were innocent people killed by the government. Argentina killed 20,000 to 30,000 civilians, and other Operation Condor nations killed tens of thousands more. Anti-communist extermination has spread all across Latin America, always with the assistance of the United States. Taken together, the death toll approaches the estimated size of the 1965 to 1966 massacres in Indonesia. Even the anti-communist great enemy, the supposed reason for all this terror, did not deploy this kind of violence. Using numbers compiled by the U.S.-funded Freedom House organization, historian John Coatsworth concluded that from 1960 to 1990, the number of victims of U.S.-backed violence in Latin America, quote, vastly exceeded the number of people killed in the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc over the same period of time. The fall. Actually, now I'm going to take a drink. Alright. Actually, how much is left? I want to know how much is left. Oh, 4 pages. Cool. Seems like it was almost done too. The fall. The violence in Central America raged on until the fall of the Berlin Wall, and then kept going. From 1989 to 1991, the Soviet Union fell apart spectacularly, along with all the states that Moscow directly established in the wake of World War II. The Second World was no more, and its residents experienced this as the literal collapse of their governments. For the rest of the planet, most of which had somehow been affected by the Cold War, some things changed, and some things did not. In the First World, North Americans and Western Europeans watched triumphantly, leaders in the West felt vindicated by very persuasive evidence that Soviet communism was not a sustainable system. In parts of the Third World, most specifically the regions where the Cold War was still being fought, there was some relief. Benny was able, finally, to triumph at the UN. He had been lobbying for years to get the US to stop recognizing the Khmer Rouge as Cambodia's official government and trying to tell the world about the horrors inflicted by Pol Pot. Benny was influential in getting enough countries on board to end the diplomatic impasse caused by Washington's stubborn opposition to Hanoi. In 1992, he moved to Siem Reap, the most chaotic part of the country, to try to help put together a new UN-coordinated coalition government. In El Salvador, a truce was finally allowed. In 1992, the FMLN rebels simply became a legal party. Historians suspect that probably could have happened long before if fanatical anti-communism had not led Washington to block any possibility of negotiations. In Nicaragua, the Sandinistas easily won the 1984 election. Washington told the right-wing opposition not to participate, since the Reagan administration did not want the vote to appear legitimate. The Contras never stopped their terrorism. It was clear to everyone, as the country went to the polls again in 1990, that the violence would not stop until the leftists lost power. The Nicaraguan people voted them out, and they left peacefully. Yep. Just keep murdering people until the people decide to vote against the left that was actually going to helping them. Maybe the right that's murdering people will actually stop murdering you. That's the thought. In Afghanistan, where Soviet troops had been trying to prop up a communist ally for 9 years, Moscow's forces retreated. The CIA-backed Islamist fundamentalists set up a fanatical theocracy, and the West stopped paying attention. Actually, the interesting thing about Afghanistan was the coup in Iran that toppled the Shah would actually also, since Iran is bordering Afghanistan, that would actually help the fundamentalists in Afghanistan, since they border together. Also, if I remember correctly, it wasn't just a communist nation of Afghanistan they were propping up. There was also a progressive-ish government before then. But due to diplomatic shit between them and the USSR came in and took out a leader there because the USSR and that leader were on the outs. So what they were propping up was a new leader that was more aligned with them. So yeah, that good old Soviet social imperialism. Anyway. I tried to be about once with Afghanistan and USSR relations, but I was actually having trouble getting all the details down because it was just a lot. So I may have actually not been exactly right, but I think I got the basics down. It's probably and it was like more complicated than what I actually said. In Chile, Pinochet had been removed from power by a national plebiscite in 1988, but he remained army commander in chief until 1998, when he became a senator for life. For the two biggest anti-communist governments ever set up in the former Third World, the end of the Cold War had an indirect effect. Both Indonesia and Brazil transitioned from authoritarian rule to multi-party democracy. They did so at different times. Brazil started the process well before the fall of the Berlin Wall, and Suharto left power almost a decade after it fell. Crucially, however, they both did it in the same way. In Brazil and Indonesia, the transition from military dictatorship was carried out in a controlled manner. Negotiated transfers of power both maintained the fundamental social structure the dictatorships were set up to protect and provided impunity for the rulers, who remained wealthy and influential. Negotiated transfers of power both maintained the fundamental social structure the dictatorships were set up to protect and provided impunity for the rulers, who remained wealthy and influential. The elites who felt threatened by social movements in the 1950s and 1960s remained in charge, and the countries were well integrated into the global capitalist system. This was now the case in almost every country in Latin America, and the vast majority of Southeast Asia. In different ways and to varying degrees, fanatical anti-communism remained a powerful force in both countries and in the surrounding regions. It took different forms, both overt and latent, but it was there, always threatening to reanimate. It certainly did not leave the earth when the putative Soviet threat disappeared. Nor did Washington change its stance toward Cuba after the fall of the Soviet Union. Instead of moderating pressure on Havana or trying a different tactic, Washington tightened the screws, passing the Helms-Burton Act in 1992 and penalizing all companies doing business with Cuba. But Cuba remained resilient. Castro buckled down, and the island made it through a so-called, quote, special period, marked by deprivation worse than it had seen since the 1950s by reintroducing capitalism and relying on tourism. Yeah, their economy is heavily reliant on tourism after that. And there was also a Cuban dollar and a capitalist dollar or something like that. I've heard that's still going on. There's like a private dollar and a public dollar or something like that. And yeah, and the two different or two different pesos or something like that. And the two are having the two just really conflict with the system a ton. I think now they're trying to phase both into the same thing. So we'll see how that goes. They also have a new constitution a few years ago where there is technically private property is allowed, but it's like controlled by the state or something like that. It's interesting. So they have like this hybrid system, but they made the hybrid system because they had to because of this right here. Well, this whole thing. It's hard to explain U.S. behavior toward Cuba as a response to the fear of Soviet communism or as a defense of freedom. From 1960 to the present, Cuba was very far from the most repressive political system or the worst violator of human rights in the hemisphere. I mean, yeah, but I'd say the explanation is uh, the effect of Cuban exiles on the government and how, for the longest time, Cuba was essentially a colony of the U.S. for big U.S. business. Perhaps Castro had committed the unforgivable sin of very publicly surviving repeated coup and assassination attempts in a way that embarrassed Washington. Or perhaps the real threat Washington perceived was the possibility of a rival model outside the global American-led system. The same thing that we know now bothered U.S. officials about Guatemala in 1954, Bandung in 1955, and Chile in 1973. Oh yeah, have that model just right on the U.S. border. Yeah. There's another thing the U.S. certainly didn't change. Immediately after the end of the Cold War, U.S. officials, especially President George H.W. Bush, had talked about a, quote, peace dividend. The idea was that with Soviet communism gone, Washington would cut back on military spending and violent foreign engagements. The exact opposite happened. There was a small decrease in spending in the 90s, and then the Pentagon budget exploded again after the turn of the century. Barack Obama ran as an anti-war candidate, yet when he finished his term in 2016, the United States was actively bombing at least 7 countries. The past 2 decades have led the best historians to take a lighter view of U.S. behavior. Before and after the Cold War, the United States was always an expansionist and aggressive power. Part of this and the explosion of the budget would be from 9/11. And yeah, that small decrease was no 9/11 was in between the fall of the USSR and 9/11 actually happening. Quote, in a historical sense, and especially as seen from the South, the Cold War was a continuation of colonialism through slightly different means, writes Odd Arn Wested. Quote, the new and rampant interventionism we have seen after the Islamist attacks on America in September 2001 is not an aberration but a continuation, in a slightly more extreme form, of U.S. policy during the Cold War. In Africa, the civil wars ended in different ways, but crony capitalism and resource extraction became the rule almost everywhere. In Eastern Europe, the collapse of communism was not as clean a process as the West often believed. Neri, the daughter of Sukarno's ambassador to Cuba, had moved to Bulgaria with her Bulgarian husband after she left Fidel's care in Havana. In 1990, Bulgaria held an election. Despite Washington's generous support for the opposition, the Bulgarian Socialist Party, the new name for the communists, won. But U.S. and European officials made it clear they were unwilling to deal with the socialists, and after a period of strife and protest, the socialists handed power to a coalition government. Over the next few years, living standards dropped precipitously. Neri and her husband, who had been used to high employment and decent public services at least, if not democratic freedoms, watched in horror as the economy shrank for 9 years in a row and inflation spiraled out of control. Quote, when I finally got to go back to Indonesia, it was shocking to hear what people think communism is, Yuri said. Quote, I lived through it, and they are just wrong. And living in Bulgaria under communism was a hell of a lot better than living in Suharto's Indonesia. In Guatemala, the Civil War ended in 1996. The surviving people of Ilom were finally able to return home and reconstruct their tiny village. The only way to get there now, if you don't have a car, is to climb windy, dangerous roads on a crowded, recycled school bus from the United States. The journey takes 2 to 3 days from Guatemala City, about 80 miles away. Oh, windy, dangerous roads on a crowded, recycled school bus from the United States. The journey takes 2 to 3 days from Guatemala City, about 80 miles away. The Mayans still wear the red skirts that Antonio's mother was wearing the day she realized her mother had been burned alive. Villagers still farm corn, wake up early, and take horses through the trees to work the fields. And come home. The Mayans still wear the red skirts that Antonio's mother was wearing the day she realized her mother had been burned alive. The Mayans still wear the red skirts that Antonio's mother was wearing the day she realized her neighbor had been burned alive. Villagers still farm corn, wake up early, and take horses through the trees to work the fields, and come home at sunset to sit and tell stories and excel and laugh. But to participate in modern economy but to participate in the modern economy that was growing up around them, they also need money. For that, they send their teenage sons and daughters to the United States. Josepha's son went in 2016 when he was 17. But to participate in the modern economy that has grown up around them, they also need money. For that, they send their teenage sons and daughters to the United States. Joseph's son went in 2016 when he was 17. Everyone knows that if you go before you turn 18, it's easier to get in the country and stay there. He has a construction job in Florida, where he learned pretty good Spanish. Having paid back his coyote, the man who smuggled him across the border, he can send money home. Yeah, this right here is the shit that Republicans are always bitching about. The migrants coming over for the jobs or whatever. Dude, they're coming over because our fucking military and CIA and State Department is fucking killing their people and making it to where they have to come over to fucking get money. Dude. It's all because of our government. Don't hate them for doing what they have to survive. Hate our government for making them have to do that, dude. Ilham keeps sending more of its youth up north. This is not about love for the United States or the American dream. They don't want to go. They know who was responsible for the violence they'd suffered. Quote, a lot of us have gone to the United States, said Antonio Caba as he was showing me around Ilham. We walked by the plaza where he watched almost every man he knew get murdered for being some kind of a suspected communist. He said, quote, I guess it's funny. Well, maybe funny isn't the word. But we know who is responsible for the violence that destroyed this place. We know it was the United States that was behind it. But we keep sending our kids there because they have nowhere else to go. End of chapter 10. Alright. Chapter 11's next. There's like 13 chapters, so like 3 chapters left. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Only 12 this time. Anyway, chapter 11's next. We are the champions. I will probably do that maybe tomorrow. If not tomorrow, then I'll do it Tuesday. And after Tuesday, probably Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Or if not Friday, then Saturday and Sunday. I'm not really sure. Of course, I don't know what I'm gonna do now. Ugh. Alright. I don't know. Yeah, fuck it. I know what I'm doing. Although, what time is it? 1:23. I don't know. Yeah. Yeah. I want to close that.